So my name is Mike Wildemariam, Director of the African Studies Center. I want to welcome everyone to another Rodney seminar. This is a special Rodney seminar because it's being held in conjunction with the Global Development Policy Center at the Pardee School. So, special thanks to Kevin and Pamela for helping to co-organize this event. This event is part of actually a joint project and series with GDP called or titled The Political Economy of African Foreign Policy. So it's going to be a series that we're still developing, but looks at the economic dimensions of African foreign policy. So questions of economic statecraft, the ways in which African states are leveraging foreign relations for the purposes of national development, a variety of issues that we'll be looking at, but placing a particular emphasis on African agency. So, I think given that theme, it's fitting that we have Alden Young here to give a lecture titled "After the Developmental State, Hajj Hamad and the Geopolitics of the Horn of Africa." Actually quite a timely topic. And if you don't know Hajj Hamad, you wouldn't realize this, but it's timely because it's on Sudan, which is now in the midst of this coup. And Hajj Hamad was a well-known Sudanese intellectual, economic and political thinker. So again, I think a very timely talk. So let me say a few words about Alden. I know Alden very well, so I actually don't need notes to give you his bio. But he's a 2013 PhD from UCLA, rather from Princeton. Spent some time as assistant professor at Drexel and is now an assistant professor at UCLA in the Department of African American Studies. His work, he's a historian of Northeast Africa. He wrote a big book in 2017 called Transforming Sudan, Decolonization, Economic Development, and State Formation. So that was a history of economic planning in Sudan in the late colonial period and then into the early post-independence period. Very well-regarded book. Published a variety of articles on Sudan, had a recent article in a journal called Modern Intellectual History on the issue of race in Africa, which was really, really quite fascinating. As I think Alden would agree, is a public intellectual, writes in a lot of different outlets, foreign affairs, Africa as a country, foreign policy, is a fellow at the Quincy Institute for International Statecraft. Alden, did I get the title right of Quincy? I feel like I just botched it. What's the actual title?
We call ourselves Responsible Statecraft.
Responsible Statecraft. Okay, thanks. Good. So it's a real pleasure, I think, for us to be hosting Alden, and we really look forward to the discussion. Alden, I'll let you kick it off for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be here with so many friends and people that I've long admired, like James McCann, and to see so many familiar faces in the audience as well. As Mike is saying, I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book, which is it's not really a biography, but a discussion of the works of a Sudanese intellectual and analyst named Muhammad Abu Qasim Hajj Hamad. And it's interesting because it looks, and I hope it'll be interesting for the conversation as we go on today, because it looks at the intersection of Sudanese and Eritrean Ethiopian politics. And we'll see as we talk today. Today's a new talk, and so bear with me if it's a little bit experimental. So it's not my classic talk, but I felt like with the crisis that's currently going on in the Horn of Africa, as I've been doing some of translating of Hajj Hamad's works, I noticed that in particular he talks a lot about the similar themes to those that are going on at the moment. In particular, the talk today will focus on a chapter from the mid-1990s, where Hajj Hamad is talking about being in Asmara at a convening of the Sudanese opposition, talking about what is to be done about the military coup in Sudan in 1995, and talking about what's the role of the Eritrean state vis-a-vis Ethiopia and what is to be done with what he sees as a general crisis of the Horn of Africa. And now you might ask yourself, what does this have to do with development? But I'm going to try to explain to you how, for Hajj Hamad, the idea of a greater Horn of Africa emerges from his discussions or his frustrations with the developmental state in Sudan in the 1960s. But first, I want to talk about who is Hajj Hamad, how do we think about him, what kind of a figure is he, and why do we use this phrase geopolitics? It's something that Hajj Hamad himself uses a lot, al-geographia, siyasiyya, which is the science that he sees himself as practicing. For Muhammad Abu al-Qasim Hajj Hamad, I've been struggling to think about what role he actually played, what's his profession. And in the beginning of my project, I wanted him to be a political economist. And I was like, okay, I'm looking for this new generation of Sudanese political economists coming of age after the October 64 revolution in Sudan, which overthrows the first military government. And Hajj Hamad was a youth activist participating in this revolution. He doesn't go to college. He's one of the he's a high school activist. And he becomes immediately involved with Sudanese protests against the war in Congo, particularly the idea of American and foreign intervention in the Congo. And then from there, he becomes increasingly involved in the idea that Haile Selassie is a key part of the axis of what he calls a counter-revolutionary axis in the region. And that part of the reason the Aboud regime was so strong and the military was so strong in Sudan, he sees as being part of this axis of counter-revolution throughout the region. And in the early 1960s, he becomes intimately involved in the Eritrean liberation struggle. And this actually becomes a passion for the majority of his career. From the 1960s through the 1990s, Hajj Hamad unfortunately dies early in 2004. So at in the early decades, early part of the 21st century, right after 9/11. But here's a little passage where he kind of tries to explain what he sees himself as doing in the 1990s. He says, first, I thank Al-Hayat for this meeting. So he primarily writes in Arabic, actually he almost only writes in Arabic, and he serves as an Arabic spokesperson for Isaias Afwerki. First, he's in the ELF, and later he turns, to Isaias's side, and he does a lot of negotiations. I found out he also sets up a think tank in Cyprus in order to allow the Eritreans to negotiate with the Israelis, but he's a pan-Middle Eastern negotiator, and he's a frequent spokesperson in the Arabic media, particularly the Lebanese media, where he lives for many years in Beirut in the 1970s. First, I thank Al-Hayat for this meeting. It is necessary to confirm that I am not an official spokesperson for the Eritrean state, and my observations are the observations of a man who is an expert in the affairs of the region, who lived and has lived it for 30 years. So I speak on the basis of my experiences, my expertise, and my relationships, and not on the basis of any position or responsibilities. So even during the long years I dedicated to the Eritrean revolution, I was not working or speaking as a representative of the Eritreans. So they are responsible for their affairs and their decisions, firstly and lastly. So my position was limited to explaining the crisis and the paths for dealing with them. And perhaps the Sudanese or Eritreans did not share my theories. And here I just wanted to highlight this, this idea that he's both speaking on behalf of, Eritreans and Sudanese, and he sees himself as an analyst, right? As a spokesperson, as a propagandist, speaking to different media, but also as an individual. One of the reasons that Hajj Hamad, I think, retains a certain relevance in contemporary thought. And right here, you can see a picture of a recent Al Jazeera documentary on the life of Hajj Hamad, which says, the philosopher of Sudan, is that he never also joins the NCP, never joins the National Congress Party or the National Islamic Front. He remains sort of this outsider, this expert that can talk on regional affairs, whether or not those are religious, whether or not those are racial, whether or not those are political, geostrategic. And I think for Hajj Hamad, and what's interesting for those of us interested in international relations, is he also posits a slightly different theory that we'll see coming for international relations, right? International relations is not simply the relations of states, as anyone who works on sort of Northeast Africa knows, but it's about races, it's about tribes, civilizations, religions, with the idea of the big powers and the regional states all being taken seriously as sort of actors acting on the same stage. And so I think for him, that gives this meaning to geopolitics. And then the chapter we're going to talk about today is the 21st chapter of what is a 2-volume history of Sudan. Sudan المعزق التاريخي وآفاق المستقبل. So Sudan, historical dilemmas and future prospects. And it was written twice. The first edition comes out in 1980, and now we're referring to the 1996 edition, which has this additional material where Hajj Hamad is talking about the 1989 coup, the crisis, and acting as a participant observer with the Sudanese resistance in Asmara in the 1995 meeting. And so the setting for the meeting that we're going to talk about today is this the period between the 15th and the 23rd of June, 1995. The Democratic National Gathering is held a meeting in Asmara. 56 representatives of the opposition attend from the DUP, the UMA, and the SPLM, in addition to the Communist Party, with a gathering of the Sudanese African parties, a meeting of the Beja Congress, the trade unions, the legal leaders of the Sudanese armed forces prior to the coup. And Hajj Hamad says, I was among the officials who observed and did not participate, though he seems to be giving a lot of talks, as we'll see later during his own recounting of the meeting. But he says, and this is his big criticism, the National Democratic Gathering consisted of the parties which shared in the annihilation of the democracies of Sudan by way of military coups against it or its abortion from the inside. So he's like, sure, all of these parties have gathered, the UMA party, the DUP, but all of these parties, he says, are actually intimately anti-democratic at their core. And part of the reason he thinks that the 1989 coup took place so easily is because the supposed democratic forces are deeply anti-democratic. And they've all made compromises with military regimes for their own advantage. And so he says the Sudanese people are were loath to put their lives on the risk when these parties called, when Sadiq al-Mahdi was removed from power, because they know that these parties themselves are deeply anti-democratic. This is sort of to set the scene for what we'll talk about today. But how did I come to this project? I came to this project as an outgrowth of my first book, which was Transforming Sudan, Decolonization, Economic Development, and State Formation, which Mike said came out in 2017. And it looked at the first generation of Sudanese economic planners, and their idea was to create an import-export economy. Would be exports from agriculture. They would greatly expand the export of commercial agriculture, particularly in the Gezira scheme, an image of which you can see on the cover of the book, which is a satellite photo that NASA took. And they wanted to triple it in size. And they hope to use that as the basis of their national development plans for the creation, for the development of a Sudanese state in a 10-year plan. First launched in 1961 and scheduled to complete in 1971. And one of the things that many of the Sudanese planners thought was that in order to do this, we needed to actually limit the democracy. So a number of the key Sudanese planners like Mahmoud Bahari sided with the military coup in 1959 to create a technocratic government that's first going to invest in the core regions of Sudan. And they hope to use the transformation in the core regions of Sudan to pay for investments in eventually in what they deem to be the peripheral regions of Sudan, or regions farther from the center. This, of course, doesn't work. It only inflames the antagonisms that are already present in Sudan in the 1950s. The dismissal of parliament means that, even the few Southern representatives in the parliament in the 1950s are forced to go home. The armed struggle seems to be the only way to represent yourself. And so you see an escalation of the armed struggle in the 1960s, combined with attempts by the Aboud regime to do Arabization by force and military occupation in the South. You also see, this is the period in which you also start to see resistance movements in Darfur, frequently using the rhetoric of development And you start to see movements in the Nuba Mountains and in the Beja regions. But this will fail. The military regime will be driven from power in 1964, only to be replaced in 1969 with a new military regime of General Numeri, Jafar Numeri, who comes to power also with the support of the Sudanese Communist Party, at the time the largest communist party in Africa. But it's in this period that Hajj Hamad and a number of Sudanese intellectuals actually grow increasingly frustrated with the idea of revolutionary change inside of Sudan, or the idea that the Sudanese will be able to either develop or seriously democratize their society. And of course, the military regime, the Communist Party, left-wing tendency of the Jafar Numeri regime only lasts for about 3 years, resulting in another coup that leads to a purge of those elements in 1971. And it's in that period that Hajj Hamad says, the problem is that we don't actually have a coherent civilization. We don't have a coherent culture, national culture, kind of national consciousness in Sudan. And we're surrounded, he says, by counter-revolutionary imperialist forces. And so if we're not able to change the region, we won't be able to change in Sudan. And it's in that period that Hajj Hamad devotes himself to the Eritrean liberation cause. And he moves during the 1970s to Beirut. And in Beirut, he actually founds the Arab Media Office for the ELF. And there he becomes an Arab propagandist and begins sort of his international journey. And while in Beirut, he famously has a kind of, in his own narration, he has a crisis of consciousness. You know, he stops praying, he gives up Islam. He says, how can I pray when I see the Palestinians dying, you know, with all the struggle and strife in the world, before going up to Jebel Lebanon, and there, you know, having a kind of revelation that brings him back to his faith. And there he posits a new idea. He calls it, he writes his book in 1979. That's one of his most famous books. The Second Islamic Globalization, in which he posits this kind of new vision of Islam. And the next year he writes the book that we're discussing, Sudan, Historical Dilemmas and Future Prospects. But this is sort of a backdrop. I had kind of assumed that Hajj Hamad, because there's not much written about him in English, was kind of, you know, a historical figure, interesting, you know, maybe as a way of thinking about regional affairs, but, you know, not really someone in current dialogue. Until I arrived in Sudan in 2018, actually with the help of someone named Yasser Zaidan, who's now a student of international relations at the University of Washington, at Washington University. And he brought me to a new think tank called the Center for Democracy and Public Policy. And as someone who had been going back and forth to Sudan since 2008, this was kind of new for me. It was a really professionally run think tank, and it was full of young people. Interestingly, all of whom had been chosen because they had done their bachelor's inside Sudan, but most of whom had been sent abroad to do their master's degrees. And you could tell that it was an interesting grouping because it was children who seemed like they came from families that were still sort of connected to the regime, but were positing this idea that Sudan needed a transformation. For them, Sudan needed a new developmental state. Their idea was that Sudan had never had a developmental state. I don't know if that's true. I mean, my own book says that Sudan has had several maybe developmental projects. And they were looking at Ethiopia as a successful model in 2018. Their idea was that, you know, if we could create a party that was as highly functional as the EPDRF in Ethiopia, Sudan would be in a better place. We could transform the NCP into such an institution. But what was interesting to me was that they started bringing up Hajj Hamad as perhaps a useful model, particularly as these children, as these young leaders were thinking about, you know, one of the problems is that what they called the Islamic project, or the civilizational project in Sudan, had failed. Their analysis was that the project of the NIF to Islamize society had run its course, and that in order to further develop Sudan, it needed to be put on a new basis. We needed both to be able to achieve national development, but we still needed a new kind of hegemonic dialogue in order to allow national development to proceed. And I think part of it is this question that Hajj Hamad comes to, that, you know, for development, for state building to occur, there actually has to be a hegemonic project. And part of his analysis is that what the colonial state did in Sudan starting in the 19th century was that it prevented any of the possible integrating projects. He likes this word, integrating projects, from consolidating their control in the country. And so you get this project where Sudan is multiple poles, but none of them are fully integrated. And so I thought it was interesting, and it sparked my imagination that, you know, that these young intellectuals were thinking, you know, with somebody like Hajj Hamad, even as they were trying to come up with practical solutions to the problem of transitioning from the NCP. Everyone could see that the NCP and the regime of Omar al-Bashir was sort of a spent force, at least intellectually, but the problem was what would come after the NCP. And this, of course, goes back in some ways, the idea of the crisis of intellect, the crisis of the intellectual, is something that's actually a reoccurring trope in Sudanese thought. Hajj Hamad says, Khatmiya, Ansar, and the Unionists are among the vast expanse which has stopped the growth and development of Sudan for years. These are the traditional parties and Sufi orders that come to power sort of in the 1950s and the early independence period. Traditionally, Arabism has been averse to opening up when confronted with an Africa advancing on all sides, while Marxism wished with selected texts to impose its own will upon the historical dialectic of objective reality. The reliable Salafi brothers confiscated the present in the name of the past. Their golden moments in time are couched in the beyond, or in what is after death. They are living in the present with a permanent duality of alienation. Their ideology is the past, despite the fact that they are living in a different present. And so here you also see Hajj Hamad talking about this idea that the main political tendencies in Sudan are not ill-equipped to take up the challenge of directing Sudan in its present. And for him, you know, core to that is this idea of geopolitics, right? This idea of being able to accurately assess the range of forces at any given moment in order to shepherd this, the ship of the Sudanese state. And it was interesting to me that this is kind of a similar critique to that launched by people like Ahmed Awab at the CDPP in 2018. And Hajj Hamad sort of posits this in a kind of geographic sense, right? He says one of both the advantages and crises of Sudan is sort of its geographic, and geography not just meaning like physical geography, but also human geographic positioning. And he says, so the Sudan takes its geographical location in the eastern corner of the African continent, where it meets the civilizations and borders, making contact between the Western Sudanic progeny, which extends from the west of the Nile to the Atlantic Ocean and across the savanna basin between the forest and the desert, and between the progeny of the Ethiopian plateau, which are usually named in terms of races, the Hamitic, and which include the area that is between the Nile and the Red Sea to the east. And Sudan is not only considered to touch and geographically and culturally connect what is between the peoples of the African continent to the east and to the west of the Nile. Instead, this area also touches what is inclusive and encompassing of Equatorial Africa, which extends to the south and arrives to the lakes of the Nile in Uganda and Kenya. And we add to it that after all of that is the only area of Africa in which the Arabs spread by extension, including the actions of Nisba, which encompass all of these specified African parties and their cultural and racial origins and formations. So Sudan is the largest circle of interaction, including all of the types of the African continent. So it is the geographic mediator between the different divisions. And so for Hajj Hamad, and this becomes part of his idea that we'll see later when he posits the idea of a greater Horn of Africa, for Hajj Hamad, it is important to realize that Sudan is actually the meeting place of many different groups, not a kind of duality. He's very worried about this idea of the colonial duality between African and Arabs. It's actually, for him, a much wider group. And that also opens up wider grouping, and it also opens up new possibilities for Hajj Hamad in particular, this idea that there's a natural order of something that could be called a greater Horn of Africa. For him, one of his political projects in the 1990s, and here he's under the sponsorship of Isaias Afwerki as well, is an idea that there can be a union between Khartoum and Addis Ababa, and that if you could bring those two capitals into alignment, you could create something that he calls a greater Horn of Africa, and then you could encircle other states around that. A kind of unity of the Nile Valley, a Red Sea area. It could be this mediator between the Middle East and Africa, and it would be a natural place from which you could do politics, right? That's one of his core ideas. And then he looks at Eritrea, right? So by now, in the mid-90s, he's based in Asmara. He's working for Isaias Afwerki, but he's also trying to explain in the Arabic press why Eritrea was an important idea. And he says particularly that the concept of belonging for the Arabs at the Eritrean level is a geopolitical belonging. And it is supported by historical and civilizational roots, but it is not a national belonging, as belonging for the Africans in total. So the African continent is with numerous types of cultural mixtures, which don't always prove one national character, even if they proved some manifestations during the stage that the nationalist movement was opposed directly to European colonialism. So indeed, these liberation struggles, which bestowed legitimacy on the unity of African nationalist tendencies, were not able to deal with Eritrea's national rights. And there was not value which was imposed upon the Eritrean people that pushed the value of the ideas of liberation in the African continent upon the account of its national freedom. So he's trying to say that Eritrea, was pulled towards the Arabs. I mean, he's an Arab, he's propagandist in the Arabic press, but the Eritreans couldn't declare themselves to be Arabs. That would have been he quotes Isaias Afwerki several times, that would have been shedding of our skin. And then he says that at the same time, we didn't want to support, the Americans and become a base for counter-revolution, because he says that would also have been shedding of our skin. But even turning towards Africa, the idea of an African unity, the OAU, for instance, wouldn't support Eritrean independence. And so that's also been a problem. Where does Eritrea sit? Eritrea sort of sits in the crossroads of these different identities. He posits this idea of an Eritreanness, but then he goes on to argue that Eritrea is also the perfect base from which to connect the rest of the Horn of Africa, that Eritrea already naturally includes large parts of Sudan, or Sudanese people is connected to Djibouti. He talks about a Tigrinya Confederation, which seems like a faraway place maybe in this current moment. These would pull together the Horn of Africa sort of naturally. Of course, he's working for Isaias Afwerki. This is just to show you that he's based in Asmara in 1995. And he's thinking about this whole region being pulled together, what he calls a confederation of the greater Horn of Africa. Eventually, the greater Horn of Africa supposedly extends out to include the Red Sea. He talks about Kenya and Tanzania. One of the problems with Kenya and Tanzania for him is that they're oriented differently. They're part of what he sees as the British Commonwealth. And he says that's one of the big tensions also with South Sudan. This tension that he says is a historical tension going all the way back about whether or not South Sudan is part of East Africa, or whether or not South Sudan can be authentically incorporated into a greater Horn of Africa. He suggests that it will be eventually incorporated, but that this is the sort of the struggle underlying the SPLM, and it's a dilemma for the National Democratic Gathering of opposition officials, because if they're based in East Africa or South Sudan, they lose their connection, he says, to Northern Sudan. And so he puts forth this idea of a confederation of the Horn of Africa. And he cites it all the way back to Johannes of Tigray. He says, I already put forth the concept of the Confederation of the Horn of Africa, and that Asmara should become the capital of the Confederation. Indeed, this project is that which will realize peace and define the identity and affiliations and strengthen the unity of interests, not in relation to Eritrea alone, but with all of the countries of the Horn of Africa. Indeed, the birth of this entity was delayed by a complete century. Indeed, it was first suggested by Emperor Johannes IV in his letter to the Khalifa al-Mahdi in Sudan dated December 25th, 1888. The most important strategic specifications for this confederal project is that it eliminates the binary, conflicting racial and religious divisions, as conflicts between the South and North of Sudan, African Arab, Christian Muslim, or in Eritrea, Muslim Christian, or in Ethiopia, Amhara, Oromo, Tigrinya, or in Djibouti, Afar or Isa, in order for all to live together, included in one entity, carrying the characteristics of all, and not elevating one side above another, as rules in the contemporary country structure. Indeed, there will not be a South and North Sudan, or a struggle between Christians and Muslims, or a struggle of Amharas and Oromos. So the entity will contain all of it. And this is his core ideas. If you expand, you could actually alleviate some of these tensions that he says are inherent in sort of the kind of colonial legacy in each of these individual countries. But he ties this to this idea that there was a time in the imaginary past when this sort of took place, and you're sort of seeing it in sort of the recent uprisings. This was a photo taken in 2019 after the fall of Omar al-Bashir, Asli al-Khadarat. So, Sudan is the origin of civilization, and it's a picture of the Merowe pyramids. And you see in Hajj Hamad this idea as well, that it was in the time of Merowe was the only time, at the time of Kush was the only time in which Sudan was actually able to exercise, that there was a civilization in Sudan that exercised a hegemony across the region, one that he claims stretched across the Sahel through the integrating large parts of the Horn of Africa. And it's not clear, that these are always factually true. As a historian, it's more a representation in the present of what is possible. And that, it's this kind of a construction, this kind of a civilizational project, one that's for Hajj Hamad, I think, important that it's written in contrast in the mid-1990s, in contrast to the civilizational project of people like Omar al-Bashir and Hassan al-Turabi, this idea of an Arabizing civilizational project, an Islamo-Arab civilizational project. He wants to ground this now on a kind of Northeast African civilization, one that, of course, includes Islam, but is slightly different. Elsewhere in the text, he comes up with this idea of an African Sufism. And here it's also always interesting that when he does this, he's not actually referring to the Sufi orders in Sudan, of which he himself is a member of Khatmiya. But he doesn't, write about Khatmiya to do this, right? He's talking about it almost like a social scientific category. And he uses a lot of American anthropology to base his ideas of Sufism on. Though he's a person who's very well grounded in the Islamic sciences. He writes after this book a number of tafsirs of the Quran. He's famous in Sudan also for his Quranic interpretation. So his decision to use Western social science in translation is because he's trying to use it as an analytical category. He's trying to create a concept that can be a basis for a new politics of Sudan, right? An integrative politics in which you take sort of part of the Islamic Arab identity and the African identity and you merge it together in a different way, and that this can be the basis for a kind of regional hegemony. But it's not, everything is not completely rosy. Hajj Hamad is not someone who's, he's not someone who's like, he doesn't have criticisms, right? I mean, in the way he narrates this 1995 meeting, his big enemy or his major interlocutor is John Garang, and who are both present at the meeting. And he says, I had hoped in the Asmara meeting that the forces of the Northern opposition would grasp the constants of the Islamic Arab identity for the north of Sudan. and include plural openings, which will be spread wide for positive interactions with all sections of Sudanese society in terms of religion, civilization, and culture. And I spoke frequently in order to clarify that Islam in its reality accepts that and more than the logic of Western pluralism. Logic of Western pluralism, and that Arabism accepts that because it mixes civilizations and races, and it is not one, but they articulated something else under the influence of their naive secularism and by the influence of Garang. It is known that Garang was the most insistent upon meeting my words, and he realized my fundamental differences with his program. And so here you see that Hajj Hamad is actually engaged sort of in an argument with John Garang. And for him, John Garang's program was one of secularism. And even more dangerously, Hajj Hamad says that John Garang, and this is where you see Hajj Hamad's commitments as a northern Sudanese person of the middle section of the country, he thinks that Hajj Hamad is trying to build an alliance of the peripheries that will encircle and sort of challenge the dominance of the North. Instead of integrating them, he thinks that this is, that partition of South Sudan is only a first step in the encirclement of Khartoum and places like that, and the creation of a different alliance. And he thinks that the northern elites, because they're angry at the Bashir regime, are willing to sell this out in favor of short-term tactical gains. But he doesn't think this will work. For him, right, what do you call it? It's important to both integrate a kind of Arab Islamic identity in a larger identity that can be inclusive. He says that, of course, integrating both Khartoum and Addis Ababa together means that you're including, the huge Christian populations, but all of this should be doable under an identity that's framed around the Horn of Africa as one sort of people. Distinct for him from Equatorians, from the West Africans, from the Arabs. And so it's also a geopolitical, but also in some ways a racial project. And the other danger for him is, of course, what he sees as another Greater Horn of Africa project being led, he says, unwittingly by Hassan al-Turabi, who's invited in what he calls the Arab Afghans, who he thinks in this period are also trying to foment an Oromo rebellion, but to create a Horn of Africa that would be governed by Islamic fundamentalism. And he sees this as one of the core dangers to the regime in Sudan, that it's been captured by Islamic fundamentalists, making it a fragile regime and one that will be tied in inherent instability for the region. But I started this project actually thinking about economic development. And you see a kind of question about both the legacy of the colonial state in the works of Hajj Hamad, but I was surprised by the extent to which for Hajj Hamad, economic development can only come through what he considers to be this process of integration. And at first, it's a question of integrating a kind of stable Sudan and their lack of hegemonic project in Sudan. But then it seems that by the 1970s, and particularly by the time he's writing in the 1990s, that project has been superseded. It's not about economic development in one country alone, but this question of economic development of an entire region. And how do you imagine this region as the unit for Hajj Hamad? Otherwise, for Hajj Hamad, the region will always be sort of any developmental project inside the region, any developmental state, whether or not Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, or possibly South Sudan, though he speaks very dismissively of South Sudan, will always be undermined from one of the others, right? All of the states are played off constantly against each other by the imperialist forces or the forces of counter-revolution. For him, it's only by integrating this region that there can be kind of a progressive or developmental project in Sudan. In the Greater Horn of Africa. Thank you, guys.
Great, thanks, Alden. Much appreciated. That was great. I will give you a digital round of applause, and we'll ask some questions. And so I'm sure folks have questions. I want to lead with one and let you talk about it. I wonder if you could say a bit more about kind of the economic, like what the economic theory was for Hajj Hamad, right? So there's this political project. I mean, there's a crisis in Sudan, long-running internal crisis in Sudan that he's responding to, and so his solution to that is this agenda of regional, regional integration, right? And we've talked about the sort of political elements. I mean, this kind of envisioning of a new regional identity. What were the economic elements? I mean, is the role of kind of, you think right now with, the Nile, hydropower, I mean, what was the economic glue that was to link these countries together?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, and so Hajj Hamad actually thinks that there's been a progress in sort of, one of his arguments is that, we've had these organizations like COMESA, we've had an ECA, we've had IGAD, we have these organizations that he thinks are trying to create kind of what he calls common markets across the African continent. But he thinks that these don't go far enough, that actually we need to create a different type of political structure that would sort of bind these elites together. And he's kind of writing in this crisis in sort of the 1970s, in which there's this argument that Sudan was betrayed in the 1960s by its own elites, right? And so its commercial and economic elites were actually, I guess for lack of a better word, comprador elites, and that they sided with the imperial regime, the imperial powers, to overthrow the late 1960s government in Sudan. And so it is this idea of a kind of national bourgeoisie also at work in the kind of ideas of Hajj Hamad. But the question is, can you expand that bourgeoisie to not just be a bourgeoisie in one country, but something that interlaces all of these different countries together?
Thanks. Jim McCann, go ahead.
Alden, thank you. This is really interesting. This was a set of issues that I was not familiar with at all. And so if I were to take the vision that you're describing here, it sounds to me like the vision of Menelik II, who foresaw Somalia and the wider Horn as his field of play. My other question is the deeper one. I have a good friend who's a Republican brother, whose world has now shifted to the Gulf as the point of reference. And he's a follower of Mahmoud Tawa, who is an intellectual technocrat in his philosophies of Islam. I wonder if you could contrast those two visions, one of which is not a nationalist vision so much as it is one about who is the next set of intellectual leaders to lead Sudan out of the miasma it's been in.
No, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, and so I see at one hand, Hajj Hamad is reaching back, right, to these earlier ideas of integration. I mean, these aren't necessarily new ideas. And in his histories, right, he thinks that, the failure to integrate, one hand is the failure to support the Ottomans earlier. One hand, it's the failure to, tie Addis Ababa and Khartoum together, or, that only this larger unit can sort of resist kind of encirclement and manage the regional instabilities inside of each of the countries. And so I think in the present, right, it would be, the Amharas, for instance, for Hajj Hamad, can't be safe against a Tigrinya union, and they'll not be able to satisfy the Oromos until, the unit itself expands, and then each group could have sort of more breathing room. But then you're right. I think what's also interesting about this project is this idea, there's also different ideas. I think in one of Sudan's big contributions, Northern Sudan's big contributions, is you get this series of Islamic thinkers, political Islamic thinkers, who are trying to deal with, how do we re-envision an Islam that's able to govern or to create, sort of political structures in sort of the present. And so Mahmoud Muhammad Taha being, at the forefront of these arguments, But also people like Hajj Hamad citing, Hassan al-Turabi and saying that Turabi tajaddud, like his renewal, his issues, the attempt to renew a Quranic interpretation in the present and to make these structures flexible. You see this great outgrowth of writing about the Islamic State, and you see people like, I think people like Hajj Hamad are actually heavily indebted to Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, even though it becomes hard to cite him because of some questions about, questions of apostasy. But he picks up on the story of Moses and Khidr, which is a big thing for Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, and this idea that, you need to use reason to reinterpret in the present. And he's part of a project called the Islamization of Knowledge, which was a big international project in the 1980s, out of which the idea is that you can create you can create state structures for the present, or you can reconcile the social sciences with Islam. And I think at the same time as we see the rise of, or the return or memory to Hajj Hamad, we also are seeing a really important role being played by the Republican Brothers in the contemporary uprising in Sudan. For while they were a relatively small movement, I think in many ways they command much of the intellectual heights of the current uprising. And it's because of their abilities to sort of reconcile Islam or Islamic values with, kind of contemporary politics, but also their rejection. And this is something that I think Hajj Hamad did as well, rejection of the idea that the state can impose or can be the leading device to Islamize society from the top, right? It's this idea of liberalizing, that society should be liberal, but it shouldn't oppose Islamic values.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I just want to point out, when I first saw the title of your talk, one of my good friends from the 5-year project in Ethiopia was Hajj Hamad, but he was a Romo. And the name just struck me, choosing this particular designation, the implications therein, has really nothing to do with what you're talking about today, but it struck me as Hajj Hamad to me means a Romo friend. But thank you very much. Great answer.
No, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Tim, you put something in the chat. Can I just get you to kind of verbalize that question?
Sure. Alden, thank you so much for this. It's a fantastic update on something I've been puzzling on over a while. In the chat, you can click on an image that I put up, because the kind of sensibility that you're talking about in this philosopher from Sudan, in fact, is reflected in the European documentation of the area for going back as far as the middle of the 17th century. And of course, before that, because this is based on the image of a kingdom of Prester John. Now, it occurs to me that it'd be really fascinating to try to link this kind of imagery and ideology over epics, both within Africa and the Arabist tradition, but also throughout all the other Ethiopian religious and historical traditions, and the way they captured the imagination of the Europeans, such that the earliest maps of Africa have the representation of this portion of Africa as something totally separate from West Africa, South Africa, North Africa. They know it as the Horn, with a very special set of attributes that needs to be dealt with very differently.
No, thank you for that very helpful map. And that's something I hadn't fully thought about. I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping to do as I progress in this project is to kind of go through Hajj Hamad's citations, because he has a very peculiar, I mean, in this chapter, he stops citing things altogether because I guess he is there. And so he's sort of doing a kind of reportage. And actually many of the quotes, I didn't bring this up, and that's probably something I should work on. Many of the quotes are coming from different parts of the Arabic newspaper, but I haven't found the originals in the Arabic newspapers yet. But in earlier parts, especially when he gives out his kind of historical interpretation, I think that would be a really interesting place to look to see what kinds of sources he's citing. And there's also a strange politics about the knowledge of Africa in Sudan in the 1980s. And so, I mean, he has kind of experiential knowledge of the Horn, and he writes about that in a different way. But when he writes about Africa in general, right, he frequently uses Arabic translations of Western scholarship coming from Cairo. And so there's this kind of time lag that he's, using 1960s Western scholarship to write about Africa.
Right.
And so in that way, it's just this weird distance between a kind of Africa that he knows well, right? A kind of the Horn of Africa and the Arab world, which he experiences as a person. He's always going, he's like, I flew into Iran and I asked him for support, or, he knows the Israelis, he knows the Saudis and Syrians, and he has a kind of familiarity with the Somalis and the different factions in Ethiopia, but he doesn't really know West Africa or Equatorial Africa very well. And I think that allows him to write about it with a kind of either romanticism or kind of prejudice. And I'd like to know more about sort of what the implications of his need to use sort of translated Western anthropology to kind of construct this Africa is.
Well, that's really helpful too. And the way in which different parts of Africa construct other parts of Africa from narratives via European intermediaries, you might call them. I mean, much of the Western anthropology literature focused on that region is through Evans Pritchard on the Dinka and the Nuer. In other words, we don't know anything except what we've read in the ethnographies, because we've never been there and don't know what else to sort of bring to it as a framework for understanding. But as I said, the historical cartography of this might be very interesting, because there you can trace down, this map was made in 1646, and it has encapsulated within it. You can't see it because I'm afraid we're still in the process of digitizing these at 600 dots per inch. This is about 200 dots per inch. In other words, it's so blurry you can't make anything out on it. But when we get it done, you're going to be able to blow this up and see it in a much more refined way than you could if you had it in front of you and your own glasses working on it. That is, you're going to be able to see where the spots of ink are to dot the I's and the like. And what's represented in these things is the tragedy that all African cartography has, namely, it's transcriptions by a series of different European communities of local language representations, which we really don't know what they correspond to. And so we have the case where Africa is first mapped by rough translations from African languages by Europeans who have different linguistic traditions of their own and are translating things in and out of Latin and into various local colloquialisms and the like. So you have Italian versions of this map that have totally different spellings. And like, we can't even figure out who was where when until we get a kind of full corpus of digitized maps. So I'm not bragging that this will be of much help yet to you or anyone looking at that effort, which is so masterful of this philosopher you've uncovered, namely to link the local to a more grand narrative. We can't do it yet because we don't even have the basics, but we're getting there, and it's something that would be a really rich component of you to reflect on when we get the raw materials to you.
No, I can't wait to, and I'm really excited about that. And it would be interesting to look at, because he has maps that he's drawn too, and it would be interesting to look at these historical maps and his maps.
Great. That's the biggest thing we're looking for now at this point, African maps of Africa. What we've got is a whole pile of European maps of Africa, roughly translated through different linguistic traditions, which are sometimes very silly in their meaning or representation. Anyway, thank you so much. It was great session.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to let David go, and then there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll pose to you, Alden. David, go ahead.
first of all, can you hear me okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for a really great presentation. I feel like there's so much to think about in this. So what I'm curious about is, who is the audience for these, for these sorts of pronouncements? Did he see himself as speaking to primarily intellectuals, political leaders? Did these ideas percolate any, into society on the whole? Because I'm curious, I think there's often this disconnect between how public intellectuals and leaders are articulating certain regional or Pan-African visions and the way in which most people think about these things in their everyday life. So I'm curious if you, had anything to say about that.
Yeah, so I think he has, in this chapter, I think he has two different primary audiences. One is that he's talking, to the National Democratic Gathering. He's talking to Sudanese, he's chiding or kind of trying to offer his own, he's both trying to talk to the Sudanese opposition, kind of offering them sort of what we might call strategy and critique, right? And he's trying to frame what happens in this meeting, right? So he's trying to create a kind of public record of what happened in the Asmara meeting for the interests of Isaias Afwerki, to be consumed later in Sudan by other Sudanese intellectuals, a kind of explaining of what the opposition did right and did wrong. And then a lot of these statements are actually drawn from his own snippets in the Arabic press. So he's also trying to frame and justify both the Eritrean and Sudanese opposition, or Isaias Afwerki's government and the Sudanese opposition for a kind of pan-Arab audience, right? An audience that's reading the Arabic newspapers. And so something I cut out, a large section, is actually explaining why Eritrea turns down its membership in the Arab League, and then Eritrea's dealings with Israel. This is a large part of a kind of a middle section in this chapter. He has to be like, I went to Cyprus, I got the Israeli help, but we don't trust them, because he's speaking to a kind of pan-Arab audience that that is like, that is concerned about these issues. Is the independence of Eritrea actually part of an expansion of Israeli influence in the Red Sea? And I mean, whether or not this is true or not, he's kind of trying to deflate these rumors. Or he spends a lot of time trying to chide or warn the Sudanese government or the Bashir regime of, their support for Eritrean Islamic Jihad. And today, I don't know how many of us are thinking about Eritrean Islamic Jihad, but, in the early 90s, I suppose this was a major tension between Sudan and Eritrea, and there's a lot of kind of apologia, right? Isaias Afwerki was always with the Sudanese. How could the Sudanese be doing this to us? And so I think a lot of it is, this kind of, and another thing that really big for Hajj Hamad at this moment, another resource that I've only begun to use, I've begun to make transcriptions, is that he's really big. You can see that he was really big on Arab satellite TV in the second half of the 90s and early 2000s. I mean, this is a guy, and that's what I was trying to do in the first part, is this, what is his profession? I guess in some ways he's a professional propagandist, right? He's like a kind of analyst. He describes himself as a scientific analyst. And at first I was trying to call him a political economist, but I'm not sure that that's really what he's doing. But he's like, these kind of people that kind of analyze and discuss current affairs. And he's also trying to shape them, for the different patrons that he has at different times. For a while, he was resident in DC. He's in Malaysia for a little while. He works for the Gulf states. He seems to be kind of, I found videos of him defending Hassan al-Turabi after he gets kicked out of power in the 1990s. So, I mean, he's one of these people who talks for a living.
Great, thanks for the question, David. So I'll just read quickly a question from Motaz, which is on Hajj Hamad's exchange with Garang, with the quote you cite. It seems like Hamad was trying to preempt the various Southern positions, whether the Anyanya or the SPLMA factions in the civil war, or offer a way out of it. while simultaneously serving as a representative for Afewerki. Garang, for his part, at one point seemed to fight for the complete independence, and at another point to fight for autonomy within a reimagined Sudan. And then in parentheses, note, not to set aside or sidestep Tarabi's own perplexing complexity. I'd love your insights here. That's for you, Alden.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think this goes to the heart of, some of the challenge of using this source material is that, Hajj Hamad is like, when is he offering kind of what we might see as his honest opinions, or when is he offering kind of, when is he being a partisan for Isaias Afwerki? And I think, he sees two rival projects sort of to the project that he's putting forth, right? I think one of the things, he says also that, one of the things he says about John Garang, he's like, a lot of these Northern opposition leaders are underestimating John Garang. He's like, John Garang is, really smart, really well read. They just think that they're getting around him. And I think part of his hesitancy towards Garang is that he recognizes Garang as having a kind of, at least a coherent project, right? Being a rival threat for the ways in which this region could be integrated, either through Southern independence. He spends a lot of time talking about the problems of Southern independence. One, it would be a challenge if the South sort of leans against the North and kind of reorients itself towards Uganda and East Africa in general. And the other is, if the South is actually able to build the coalition that governs Sudan, right, and makes it this kind of secular state, which is, I guess, also opposed to both Isaias Afwerki and and Hajj Hamad's vision. Instead, right, this is where I think, this is the part I think that maybe we have to take with a grain of salt. Hajj Hamad in the 1990s is proposing that actually regional integration can be done through ASMAR, which, I don't know to what extent that was just a fanciful, this is his patron, right? This is his prince at this moment. And so maybe he has to kind of put forth these ideas. I don't know to what extent, that's actually, even he would have thought that that was something that was doable.
Great. So Kevin Gallagher had a question. He says, what would you see as intellectual antecedents with respect to his broader pan-Horn and development state programs? You note that he didn't think that the recent integration efforts didn't go far enough. Is he thus drawing in the new international economic order thread that was prominent in Africa in the 1970s and early 1980s, with Boumediene and others the leading advocates of? That was very much in a core versus periphery rationale for integration in national developmental states. In parentheses, Samir Amin made similar arguments. Just trying to situate where the thought is coming from. So that's his question.
Yeah, so you see a lot of underlining, you see two things, right? One is that Hajj Hamad seems to be reluctant to cite Samir Amin and people like that in his text. And I see it a lot in the English language Sudanese texts of the similar period, particularly by what we might see as the secularist intellectuals. And so I don't know if in some ways Hajj Hamad doesn't want to cite particularly Samir Amin for that reason. Samir Amin's hostility to what we might see as the Islamic tendency throughout the region. But I think if you read carefully, you see Hajj Hamad as kind of situated within a sort of world systems approach, right? And that, he basically says at some moments that Sudan is located in the fourth world. It's beyond even the third world. It's been completely peripheralized. And the project, I think, is to create a kind of culture. So I think what's different about the Islamist answer to, say, the more secularist answer is that secular developmental theory, in some ways thinks that the economics is the problem. But I think the Islamists have this kind of what we might call cultural answer, which I think is really interesting coming out in the 1980s. a kind of neo-Gramscian thing where they're like, the economics will come if we are able to culturally dominate the society and integrate it together, right? Then we will be able to develop and create our own core, moving ourselves from this kind of very marginal peripheral status back towards a kind of center. And then we'll be able to arraign other states around us. And so it's a kind of fuzzy economics, but I think it's centered on a kind of cultural reason, right? That if you can create a kind of cultural whore, cultural pole, then you can make other states kind of rotate around you. And in doing so, I think that's part of his developmental strategy.
Great. Other questions that folks may have? Well, people think about questions. Let me sort of pose one to you as well, Alden. So just one observation in thinking about how these ideas sort of play out in the present. It's interesting to me, in the context of the Eritrea-Ethiopia peace deal of 2018, there was this kind of Newhorn thesis, right, that was based on, I think, really imagined in Asmara. So you see the residue of Hajj Hamad's thought, right? Centered on Asmara, that was really an alliance of sort of core horn countries, right? Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. And in that vision, at least the way it's been presented recently, is sort of consistent with what Hajj Hamad thought in the 1990s, was that core IGAD countries like Uganda and Kenya would actually not be part of this New Horn vision, right? And I think that's really interesting and actually a real point or bone of contention right now in terms of visions of regional order, right? So I think that's just something to,
he very much thinks that Uganda and Kenya need to be kicked out.
Right.
And that they can't, that maybe not of IGAD, but that if IGAD stays, that, a confederation of the greater Horn of Africa needs to not include those states.
Yeah.
And then the question is why, right? I mean, so he thinks that Uganda and Kenya are already integrated. I mean, he calls it British Commonwealth, but they're integrated in an East African project that he sees as distinct from the sort of project that of a greater Horn of Africa. And I think, for him, they have a different economic rationale and economic basis. They have different ties to the international community, and they have a different kind of cultural project, I guess, through Swahili, a different type of integration. Whereas, this project, I guess, would be centered on Khartoum and Addis Ababa as the two cores. And then, even though he says Asmara is going to serve as the capital, it's pretty clear that it's Khartoum and Addis Ababa that are the axis that he wants to unite. And then, with Mogadishu and Djibouti sort of being forced to kind of come along, and he thinks, it's a fait accompli that South Sudan would have to come either through North Sudan or Ethiopia. And he thinks that's, and he has some arguments about why that is such, but, he thinks that, the South Sudan that he says will inevitably be dominated by the Dinka will find it more amenable to integrate into the Horn of Africa than East Africa. But he doesn't really lay out, I guess, the kind of economic basis. For him, it seems to be a kind of cultural synthesis, but also, a shared history, right? So he thinks that, the history of, or the ongoing influence, particularly of Britain in East Africa, is fundamentally different than it is in the Greater Horn.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it makes sense. I just think it's interesting the way this debate about the parameters or the boundaries of the Horn are playing out right now in ways that are really consequential to regional politics, right? I mean, this is a huge fissure at the moment. Okay, so just a question, which is how did Hajj Hamad, I don't know if he was writing at this time, but how did he respond to the Eritrea-Ethiopia border war in 1998? And then just the kind of dissent. I mean, in Eritrea after 2001, this kind of political dissent. I mean, obviously, in the early 1990s, this is a moment of kind of hope, right, in the region, right? Transformation. and obviously by 1998, the whole basis of regional integration kind of fell apart when the Samara Addis axis collapses. So did he say anything about this? Was he mute on the point? I mean, I'm just curious.
So in the mid-90s, of course, he's even positing this idea of a Tigrinya Confederation, right? He thinks that, Meles, he thinks that that's the most logical thing would be that this would emerge as a subunit within, the coming together of these broader units. So, that's within this wider project. Like many people, his time in Eritrea, as the war progresses, sort of kind of comes to an end. He eventually leaves in the late 1990s. After having taken Eritrean citizenship. When I'm in Sudan, people are saying he was an Eritrean diplomat, even though he's trying to say he wasn't. And he goes off to the Gulf and Cairo to end his last years. And I think in some ways, right, he has to get out of Eritrea as Eritrea itself is becoming a less pluralist society, right? He has to jump ship. But having gone through all of his kind of press pronouncements from the later 1990s, early 2000s, so I'm not exactly sure exactly what he says, but he also turns his major works to more tafsirs of the Quran. I think he's a bit disappointed by a lot of the projects from the 80s and 90s and how they don't quite turn out as well as he had hoped.
Great, thanks. I think, Jim, you had another question. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say, from this really interesting and engaging stratospheres discussion about what's going on here, I'm thinking about driving the road from Addis Ababa to Gondar and seeing which way are the petrol trucks going, north or south. Are they coming from the Sudanese source? Are they coming from Asab Masawa? And this is the full measure of the way integration is taking place. It shifts. Where is the petrol coming from? People are thinking about those day-to-day lives, but the context of Hajj Hamad as an intellectual philosopher, I think, is really helpful. It shows the winds of times as they progress. So just by way of thinking, saying thank you for this terrific presentation and engagement of everyone here involved.
No, thank you all for engaging. And yeah, I think you see it in Hajj Hamad, he has to keep moving, right? He's someone who I think would have stayed in Sudan, but he falls out with the different military dictatorships. He has to leave Sudan for most of the early 1990s, and he's able to return in the late 90s to give, he gives a series of public lectures where he's trying to, I think, rally around the last years of Hassan al-Turabi in power. And then, when Turabi goes, he has to also leave again. And so I think it's part of this, where the center of the region seems to be is moving constantly as these political figures are trying to find an axis.
Great. So we're almost wrapped up. We have about 10 to 12 more minutes. Are there any other questions that people want to pose?
Yeah, a few. Just one or two. On the current situation, I'm reminded by what Jim just raised, which direction are the petrol trucks going to move? There's been a lot of action in this whole region on food politics and food scarcity and the use of, some nation states bombing out other nation states' food supplies. And I just wondered if there's any insight that you can offer us on understanding the current conflicts that go across the Ethiopian-Sudan border and are causing migrations of tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, I think it was interesting in some ways. I thought I would, bring up this chapter. In some ways, because I was surprised to see. I shouldn't be surprised, but it was interesting to me to see, that many of these problems haven't, that we see in the contemporary question of, the stability of the Sudanese state, the rise of the Beja Confederation, and in Turk, leadership or his role in closing the port of Sudan, and his support maybe for the coup, or even the questions that calls the very integrity of the Sudanese state into question, at the same time as we're seeing similar questions playing out in Ethiopia. What is the future of the Ethiopian state? How will it be reorganized? I think the intervention of Eritrea earlier this year, earlier in the conflict, also calls into questions, what is the nature of Eritrea's relationship to Ethiopia? And so, I think for Hajj Hamad, he probably would say, on one hand, it's fanciful to have a confederation of the greater Horn of Africa, but on the other hand, he probably would say, these states in particular are invariably sort of involved in each other's politics in ways that are not disentangleable. And so it's actually more like recognizing a kind of reality that's taking place rather than in some ways proposing something that's completely different. And whether or not settlement in any of these conflicts is possible without a kind of, they're both intrastate conflicts, but they're also in some ways interstate conflicts. And that, that settlement also needs to be sort of put on the table at the same time. But Mike also probably knows, even more about what's happening at this current moment.
Well, that was just my question, but I'll quit here. Thanks so much. This is very helpful, Alden.
No, thank you.
Great. And anyone else? Let's see. I saw David. Did you just have your hand up?
Yeah, I just put it up.
Okay, go for it.
So I'm curious because I think we see a lot of these like regionalism ideas popping up in the 60s and 70s, and even to like some degree in the 80s. You see, for example, the Senegambia Confederation. But what you're talking about is definitely a much later period of time. And I'm wondering, how does this fit into this larger genealogy? Is there any sort of understanding of previous attempts at creating any sort of like regional project? And like what makes the particular context of, is there anything particularly noteworthy about the context where this is coming out of versus maybe some of those earlier examples?
Yeah, so I think Hajj Hamad is definitely trying to look back at a kind of, 19th century attempts, right? And this idea that, it's regional confederation that in some ways allows us to get out of a kind of neo-colonial domination. But I think what's interesting about this period is that it's set specifically and kind of contextually in the post 1991 world, right? So this idea that the United States has just launched the attack on, Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War is kind of the temporal break. And then the counterexamples for him are, the American involvement in Mogadishu and the Rwandan genocide. And he's kind of bringing these up as sort of, if our situation in the Horn isn't settled, he says that, one of these alternatives is open to us, right? We'll get attacked by one of the superpowers, like kind of like Saddam Hussein was attacked, or we'll break up and we'll have a kind of Somalia or Rwanda situation in our country. And I think integration for him is also fairly important in what he sees as a reassertion of American power in this region, right? So, if earlier there was a question of British power, he talks a lot about, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the reassertion of a kind of British hegemony in the Middle East. At this moment after 1991, it seems like there's a reassertion of American empire in the Middle East. And he says that, the Americans are kind of wild. He's like, you might think they suffered a setback in Mogadishu, but, no sooner do they suffer their setbacks in Mogadishu than they're pressuring the idea of a breakup of Sudan. and he's like, they're going to launch the attack on Khartoum from the south. And it's not clear that this is true, right? But this is the way he's interpreting, recent history. And I think for him, the idea of the Confederation is in some ways, he doesn't lose this kind of anti-imperial threat, right? I mean, I think Hajj Hamad, if he's anything, even though when I talk about him in Sudan, people frequently are like, the guy is a CIA agent. I mean, every epithet is thrown at him. But, in his works, there seems to be this kind of core anti-imperialism that sort of ties him together from the 1960s into the present. The question is for him, though, is what is the basis of an anti-imperial front, right? So, he's in Asmara, like Mike was saying, he has to leave Asmara, I think, when the conditions sort of change in a few years. But, he's in Asmara at a time in which maybe it was still possible to close your eyes and think about Isaias Afwerki as like someone who could be part of an anti-imperial axis, and then or a foundation of the anti-imperial axis. And then and he's here and he's emphasizing this idea that the Americans would like to reestablish either Eritrea or South Sudan as kind of fronts from which to attack the rest of the region. And it's interesting because it goes into a kind of long a long tradition of thinking the region, left thinking about the Horn of Africa, right? That, progressive projects in this region will be undermined by sort of imperialist forces.
Great, thanks, Alden. So I don't think I see any more hands up. So I think we can wrap up, and let's give Alden a round of applause for a great presentation. Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Alden. Hopefully we can keep the conversation going, and we wish you well.